Thank you, Matthew, for joining this webinar, and welcome everyone. Good time. Hope wherever you are, you're enjoying your time and you're ready for this presentation, which is quite interesting. I'm really looking forward to Matthew's presentation, which is on CCS from perspective of an island industrial cluster. We all know how important industrial processes are in terms of carbon capture and to achieve net zero targets. Matthew is the expert giving us the talk today in that regards. Expertise of Matthew, just to introduce Matthew briefly, as he has outlined his track record. Matthew is expert in energy manufacturing and management consultancy, and he worked in several national and international global businesses, including Unilever, BP, PA Consulting Group, and RWE. In 2003, Matthew founded a software startup, which he developed for over 14 years, and he employed 25 people and a huge amount of investment and capital projects, over £3 billion of capital projects investments. And the business is sold in 2017. And since then, Matthew is working in different roles, some voluntary roles in regional development, including board member of Greater Birmingham and Solihull LAP, and he is now advisor to the mayor of the West Midland, and also currently non-executive chair of Energy Capital West Midland. So quite a few kind of responsibilities and relevant experience Matthew has, and we're glad to have him on board. Matthew also supports the Black Country LAP on energy issues and is the program director for the Repowering the Black Country, one of the 7 UK industrial cluster decarbonisation projects. And today's presentation is going to explore actually this Repowering the Black Country project. Okay. After presentation, which is going to take about 40 minutes, you will have time to ask your questions directly from Matthew, but it would be great if you can post your questions first in the chat box, and then I can arrange it and let you actually turn on your mics and go ahead with discussion with Matthew. Okay, stage is yours, Matthew.
Okay, thank you very much, Hamid Reza, for that introduction. And thank you, in fact, in general, for inviting me along today to represent the Black Country, inviting the Black Country to talk to you as an industrial cluster. We do really appreciate it. I was, however, when I kind of started to put this presentation together, slightly anxious about it, really, in the sense that we're a long way, I think, from what you would physically, geographically, from what you would call mainstream CCS, as I understand it. So the applicability of CCS to the Black Country is kind of the overriding question, or the impact of it is the overriding question, kind of underpinning this this presentation. And I'm really interested in the discussion because the question, I put a slightly potentially provocative title, what's in it for us, as the title of the talk. But it's not intended to be provocative as much as it's a genuine question. I'm really interested in understanding how a cluster like the Black Country benefits from CCS and actually does sensible things in the context of a national infrastructure and a national economy, which is heading very much in the direction of quite large scale CCS where we can do it. So it's a genuine question. I took the brief fairly literally, in the sense of, I understand you're having presentations from each of the 7 clusters over the summer. And I'm going to give you an update on what we're doing in the Black Country, and as I say, how we see CCS potentially impacting that, but very much with a big question mark saying, you know, please tell me things we're missing or we should be doing in the context of our wider plans. Okay, so just by way of context, so you can see where we fit geographically. I know many of you will know where the Black Country is if you're based in England. It's basically in the centre of the country. It's the only inland industrial cluster within the portfolio of clusters supported by BEIS's Industrial Clusters mission. It's representative of much of UK's traditional manufacturing, probably because it's where a large part of the industrial, particularly the energy intense bit of the Industrial Revolution, really kicked off, because the Black Country is called the Black Country because in medieval times and previously it was black because of all the coal that was lying around basically near the surface. So it was actually quite, for small scale energy intense activity, very easy, very low barriers to entry for manufacturing businesses. And some of the businesses in our cluster are 250, 300 years old, still run by the same family, employing 200-300 people, doing non-ferrous foundry activity and so on. And if you didn't come across them, you would probably be amazed that they're still there, but they are. So we have characteristics which I'll probably touch on again, but large numbers of relatively small but medium-sized energy intense manufacturing activity. And while we're the smallest in terms of carbon emissions, 1.4 million tonnes of carbon emissions is our industrial carbon emissions, not our total carbon emissions. We're the largest in spatial area, so we are, you could say ambitiously, but it's a real problem. We're attempting to decarbonise a very distributed industrial base across the Black Country over the next 20 years in parallel with the other clusters. And as we continually say to BEIS, and I think they very much seem to buy into this and have got the message, and we appreciate that as well, we are representative of the kind of bigger problem in the UK, which we do need to find a solution to. So that is the actual Black Country. We have, our boundaries are coterminous, if you like, with 4 local authorities, each they're metropolitan areas, a very built up area. So industry actually distributed into the housing and the general environment by and large. Although increasingly we have quite large industrial developments as well, business parks and so on springing up around the area. Yeah, sorry, just to continue on the Black Country before I go on to the project team. The heyday of the Black Country was probably the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of decline up to about 2000. We still had 500,000 people working in energy intense manufacturing in the 1990s. That figure's now about 250,000 people, so it's halved. But it's leveled off basically, and the people who've survived are survivals. The project team. So we have funding from BEIS Innovate UK for our decarbonisation activity. Is a collaboration between the Local Enterprise Partnership, which brings together the 4 local authorities with businesses in the area, 2 universities, Warwick Manufacturing Group at University of Warwick and University of Birmingham, and 6 small businesses, in fact. And the model is a facilitating model. So we unlike the other clusters who you may have heard from, in general, their model is to work with, as a partner, the major emitter in their space. We can't really do that because we've got more than 4,000. There's actually 10,000 manufacturing businesses in the Black Country, and we're working with the 4,000 most energy intense ones as a focus. So this is a facilitating project. And I'll talk a bit more about what each of those companies are doing in a second. This is our the problem kind of space we're operating in, and the potential challenge that will face the UK, even if it solves the kind of headline problem that the industrials clusters mission overtly set itself up to solve originally, which is the kind of Pareto approach, which has a lot of sense to it, you have to say, which is to focus on those 6 clusters on the coast account for, I think it's just under 44% of UK industrial carbon emissions. And that's less than 50 firms. So you can kind of get your head around that. You can see the logic in sorting that out, because in terms of bang per buck, you get 43.7. If you solve that problem, you've got nearly 50% of the way, and it all feels doable. However, you're missing out the bulk of UK manufacturing, essentially, which is 295,000 businesses distributed across the whole of the UK, accounting for just over 50% of carbon emissions. You can actually take another slice out of this and say the kind of next tranche of mediumly large businesses, and you have to be careful with terminology, because medium in emission terms is not the same as the kind of standard business classification of a medium firm. It's much bigger, but you could probably get another 20% of emissions by going, I think, to another 100, say, firms. But then you've still got this large tail of lots of small businesses accounting for a significant proportion of UK emissions. So what we're attempting to do as the Black Country is develop a methodology for decarbonising that tail. I'm talking in Pareto terms as a tail, but the bulk of large numbers of medium small businesses, and by medium I'm talking about Jaguar Land Rover down. That's a large employer in the West Midlands, but it probably doesn't figure as an emitter, for example. Okay. So this is my kind of strategic perspective on, so how do we solve this problem as the Black Country? How do we see this problem in terms of decarbonisation? And at a very, very top-down level, it seems to me there are 5 strategies that we could adopt nationally to tackle that mass of small businesses I've talked about. One is the kind of national zero carbon infrastructure approach, which is to invest in carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen production in the northwest and the northeast, and the infrastructure around that, to use that to ship the necessary energy vectors to where they're needed around the country. So basically put a grid in that builds on those kind of investments. And that gives access to industry around the country to those kind of technologies and enables them to operate in a zero carbon way. However, that is potentially very expensive, it seems to me, but it's nevertheless one of the options that we can and so these aren't obviously exclusive, but it's just a helpful way to think about it, and it just kind of gives you an indication of where we're coming from. The second option is around relocation, which is cheaper, and that would be to recognise that carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen are best produced in certain geographical locations. Not bother so much with putting the infrastructure in to get that those kind of vectors to energy intense industry, say in the Black Country, but instead move the industry from the Black Country to the northwest and the northeast. I don't think so. That for me is a perfectly viable and sensible solution, and might well make the UK more globally competitive, because it's cheaper, because you haven't had to invest in the infrastructure and you can potentially do that over time. It does leave the Midlands with a problem, but at least it's kind of an honest problem we can engage with, because we know where we're positioned. Anyway, and people might have to move, because coming from a manufacturing background, it's difficult for me to see how the Black Country can sustain the level of population it's got if it hasn't got the manufacturing industry that brought people there in the first place. But so that's the second option. The third option is an innovation option, where I get onto slightly dodgy ground, because I'm aware you're all specialists in this space and I am not. But I think there are forms of carbon capture that might ultimately economically work for the very small sites that I'm talking about, and that distributed use of energy. We can also change our energy infrastructure locally. in innovative ways. We can put on-site renewables. We can certainly, where industrial processes can accommodate either economically and physically energy supply, which is supplyable through electricity or on-site renewable type vectors, we can do as much of that as possible. So that's clearly an important strategy, but how viable is it? And then there's the last two, which I kind of put down slightly tongue-in-cheek, really, but there you can clearly ignore the problem, which we have been doing for some time in terms of climate change and everything else. And you can also not bother to do this in the UK at all anymore and send it abroad. Again, we have been doing that for some time, and we're broadly deciding not to anymore. So the Black Country is operating broadly in the relocation innovation type space, I think. It would help to know where, and I'll come on to in a second to some of the issues with the zero carbon infrastructure approach for us, because we don't think we think the way it's done matters and could have serious unintended consequences, as I've indicated there. Okay. In fact, this is my next slide. So this is current BEI's decarbonisation strategy as presented this year, published a few weeks ago. And it's a totally logical pathway, which is essentially to invest in carbon capture and storage, infrastructure, hydrogen, and so on in the next 10 years, but explicitly focused on 1 or 2 locations. You can see 4 low carbon clusters out of the 7 there, operational in 2025. And then while you're doing that, gradually put in place policies which support fuel switching, question mark how viable they'll be, and encourage market side pull for lower carbon products and circular economy solutions and so on, which is all fine, except that our feeling is that from an investor perspective, if the logic of locating inland in somewhere like the West Midlands or the Black Country in that kind of scenario seems very, very weak. It makes it quite difficult to contemplate attracting investors to build factories in the Black Country when the logic seems, particularly energy intense stuff, when the logic seems to point much more strongly to the northeast and northwest. Again, you know, that may be viable, but that may be a viable national strategy. But we're trying to understand the degree to which government is totally committed to that, and therefore we need to think differently about what we even do in that country rather than just decarbonise it. Okay. We are though, so we are embracing local reconfiguration and innovation as our broad strategy, and this is what our project is actively doing at the moment. So I'm kind of taking it as read that you understand that the wider picture of how these projects work, but we're currently funded for 2 years to, this is a cluster planning, decarbonisation planning project. So what we're doing is sketching out more than sketching, detailing a route to decarbonisation for our industrial cluster over the next 10 to 20 years. We're doing that, as I say, for 4,000 to 8,000 businesses en masse. The project is focused around manufacturing hubs, so we've kind of got a twin track strategy. The idea is to reconfigure existing industry and new industry which we want to attract to the area into what we call zero carbon hubs, so industrial parks, but pre-designed to optimize the energy and carbon footprint of them. And that provides kind of focus for the project. So we're going to do the first 4 hub developments as part of the project. So get the people on board, do all the energy designs and everything else. And then the other strategy, the other element of the strategy is large scale engagement of the 4,000 to 8,000 businesses and supporting them in taking the first steps down this road, both tactically in terms of decarbonising their existing operations and strategically in terms of thinking through their positioning as this world changes, and really quite fundamental change in the world as we know. So those are our eight work packages. WMG are doing circular supply chains. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, which is the kind of business case at a geographic level for the areas where the Black Country should be focusing in a low carbon economy. Work package on basically economic development data, so we know where everybody is. This is the challenge of working with between 4,000 and 8,000 businesses, actually handling all the data and making sure you get to the right people and you target activity and policies in the right way is quite an important part of what we're doing. The actual design work package, that's the engineering activity to companies CR Plus and Q. CR Plus also involved in Wales, so we have a link with the Welsh cluster. Or urban horticulture, so that is a form of capture, of carbon capture in our world, and also low-grade heat, so it actually fits quite well with some of the existing operations which use high-intensity heat for melting metal, but have no use for low-intensity heat, but it can be used to support urban horticulture. The large-scale business engagement, a company called ProEnviro, and we're working virtually and directly with businesses. Birmingham looking at the policy links, so key questions like when hydrogen might or might not be available for the Black Country, and how we fit into that national picture. And then a significant activity around raising financial investment and putting in place the funds to support all this reconfiguration activity. Okay. We're clearly learning from others. I pulled this slide up because circular economy and reconfiguring so that we minimize carbon in the manufacturing operations is probably the most both challenging and radical thing we're doing in our project. As Hamid Reza said at the beginning of the meeting, I spent half my career in manufacturing, I spent half my career in energy, and the energy is the second half of my career. And when I started this project, I had almost forgotten that from an energy perspective, you tend to think about decarbonising demand, and you take the demand as given. You might want to make it more energy efficient, but the idea of actually restructuring your operations to make them more efficient before you reduce the energy or you decarbonise the energy supply, which brings the kind of manufacturing worldview into the energy worldview, was something which we hadn't really engaged with. But once we got our head around it, we realised that somewhere like the Black Country, where you've got lots of small businesses, which are actually quite easy compared to a large steelworks or oil refinery, they're quite easy to pick up and move. And they could relocate and you can break them up, and those kind of things are relatively cheap to do. So this is a big part of our project, and designing not just individual company operations to minimize carbon, but actually individual company operations in the context of neighboring companies and shifting companies around so that you get the right companies next to each other. Important part of what we do. And we're not starting from scratch. Once you get into this space, an enormous amount of thinking has gone into circular economy over the last 20 or 30 years. And there's people express it in different ways, but we've got some really good examples to learn from around the world, and we've got WMG who are helping us with that. And this is the kind of outcome we are working towards. This was our first zero carbon hub design, working with two companies which already recycle aluminium. Which is it's a really good example of how strategically we can come up with sensible things, really, both for the businesses and the UK. When we looked at the economics of aluminium kind of en masse, you find the UK, we only have one aluminium smelter left in Fort William now. The kind of broad balance of aluminium comes into the UK from other countries. It's then recycled, often by sending offshore again to be recycled or recovered and sent back to the UK, where it's then melted down and made into components for cars or whatever, which is an increasing market. You can redesign the supply chain rather than that's the term I should be using, redesign the supply chain rather than existing company operations, so that you take the aluminium, recycled aluminium, melt it down, and continuously pass it into a casting process, or I should get into trouble if I'm not careful, but well, yes, casting for the automotive market, no remelting, as it says on that slide, sorted into high grade and for automotive or even aerospace applications, and low grade for construction type applications, for example. Do all of that on one site, possibly involving multiple entities. You then end up with predictable streams of low grade heat, and indeed carbon in there somewhere, and you can feed those into complementary operations, including, say, urban agriculture. So that was our first attempt at this, which we did last year. What we're doing in the project now is we're doing 4 more of these examples for different industrial processes and opportunities, areas of the supply chain. So this is another example, a slide produced by one of the partners last week, looking at how we might support forges and foundries in the Black Country with complementary activities, again, urban horticulture featuring. And this is an example of making the best of what we've got up to the limits to which we can do that. The challenge with that is that those limits are quite low. So there's limited amount of industry you can support with waste, for example, in the Black Country. But the urban horticulture work stream is, I usually mention it because it's such a new thing for me, but it's also in the context of this conversation, it's our leading carbon capture technology at the moment. Okay. The data really important, as I've indicated, in terms of a methodology to make this whole process efficient. This is probably a dominating challenge in the space in which we're operating. You can't translate necessarily approaches that work well on a large manufacturing site or a refinery into an approach which will work successfully times 4,000 across the Black Country, because the fixed cost, the transaction cost basically of engaging with each business are too high. And also each of the businesses in the Black Country is a much harder beast to work with than a Tata Steel, for example, or similar organisation, because they simply don't have the energy managers and the sustainability managers and the level of competence that you need to engage with as an expert in the space. Ideally, all of those things tend to sit with the commercial director or the managing director, who has a million other things to do. And so it's a very different context to work in. You have to help people a lot more, and that's why the presence of the Black Country Economic Intelligence Unit in our project has been very important. And we've done things like look at the sign at the bottom there. It's a Sankey diagram, which is an obvious thing to do, but that takes you through a process which ultimately enables you to focus on, the high temperature processes are probably the ones that won't go to electricity very easily or very economically, and those are the kind of things you're going to have to support with maybe hydrogen and CCF, etc. So we can start to ask sensible questions about the right businesses in the area. Yeah, so in summary, you'd be pleased to hear this is my last slide. What we're trying to do is qualitatively different, in my view, from the methodologies that will work for the coastal clusters. But it's a really important challenge for the country, which we do need to take on and see if we can find a solution. Our project was now 6 months in. We're at the point where we are about to finalise the choice of these 4 exemplar hubs that we're going to develop in the remaining, it's actually 20 months of the project. We are developing a methodology that will be replicable nationally. The links with South Wales are one way we're doing that. So they're already we're working on. There's some similarities in some things they're doing. You'll see or will have seen already. Yeah, but we are keen to develop a methodology that can be replicated both locally and nationally. We've got some way to go to get there, so we're very keen to learn as we go along, and conversations like this are, I hope, going to be helpful in that context. We don't know the answer yet, but we have develop some views on elements of the answer, if you like. As I've alluded to a number of times, it's a facilitative type approach. We're working with statistics, statistical numbers of people. That means much more done through policy, through nudging communications, putting in zones of low carbon activity, etc., because that's the only way we can do things efficiently. We have to think imaginatively across disciplines. That's kind of obvious, I think. We're taking a flexible approach. I think that's an important point, which I should have stressed earlier, really. Again, it's all about getting the costs of intervention down. So what we've done is come up with 5 we call it a pattern book of energy type models, for high-level models for our zero carbon hubs, which have different profiles in terms of industrial energy supply, so all electric or some with hydrogen, etc., etc. And what we do is we try to match those to, in a fairly pragmatic way, with anchor businesses. And there's also, yes, and I haven't put this on the list, but there's this kind of mix of a pragmatic approach and a leadership approach. So by that I mean the pragmatic bit is we need ownership and support from our industrial base, which means if people come to us and say, we really want to do this, we're really passionate about it, and our business happens to be a non-ferrous foundry or whatever, then we will work with them, because that level of ownership and desire to do stuff is really helpful. At the same time, we are working top down and looking at the world, and it's a bit like the aluminium case, and saying these are some really obvious areas where it makes sense to base a circular economy supply chain in the Black Country. It minimises the challenges of zero carbon energy supply, maybe it minimises the challenges of carbon capture. So those are the things we want to go for. And even if no one's doing it in the Black Country at the moment, let's think through how we might make it happen and go out and proactively find the right people to do it. So we're trying to balance those two things. And that's all about kind of keeping costs down of the approach, and actually making progress as well that sticks. Infrastructure is really important. Getting the right infrastructure in place to make this easy for people. So I'm talking about district energy networks, for example. We had a really good conversation last week about putting a steam energy vector in a hub to support food processing type activities, those kind of things. And that infrastructure is shared across a whole supply chain, rather than provided the current model where you get kind of national infrastructure, or you have to do it yourself on site, excludes this vast opportunity of putting infrastructure in place which supports a particular supply chain, a particular cluster of businesses, where it is a more efficient way of delivering energy to them than either dealing with them individually or dealing with them as part of the whole country. And we're very bad at that in the UK, and I think we can get a lot better. So that's why infrastructure's in capitals there. We need to know what's going on nationally, the national infrastructure plan, because we could go very wrong if that plan doesn't actually unfold in a predictable way. So as I've alluded to already, if there's going to be no hydrogen infrastructure, for example, to the Midlands, which there's a very logical argument not to put it here, then we should be focusing on some things and not others. If there is going to be hydrogen infrastructure, we need to know when it might come, and then we can plan our economic development accordingly. These things are all critical to us. And then, question partly to you, I think I put this in because carbon capture clearly makes things much easier where you can deploy it, but the big picture for us is, or the headline is, we can't deploy it in the Black Country, so you have to forget it. Do we, or is there something you can offer us? I'd be really interested. That's a really that game-changing technology for us potentially. And just to conclude, we're a very open bunch in terms of partnerships and collaboration. So very keen to work with people, and I've included all our contacts at the bottom there within the kind of project management team of the project. So I'm a smidgen under my 40 minutes, I'm afraid, but maybe that will give us a little longer for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Very good presentation. I personally really enjoyed the talk, and really glad to see such a big project is ongoing. The ways industrial processes are have been one of the major concerns in terms of addressing the emission from these industries. So stage is open for questions. Sandra, do you want to ask your question in person? We can tell.
Yes, please. I think I have unmuted myself. I don't know if you can see me.
I can hear you.
We can hear you, Sandra.
Oh, that's good. For some reason, I can't switch on the video, but that's fine. Well, basically, I'm one of Professor Dabkhani's PhD students. I'm working on CCUS and circular economic opportunities of CCUS in the UK steel industry. So what you are doing is exactly falling into what I'm doing. And if possible, could this presentation eventually be shared, Matthew, or is that something that you hold close to your chest?
No, I don't. And in fact, I've already shared it with Karis and Hamid Reza. So you're welcome to circulate it more broadly. That's fine.
Brilliant. What I'm very interested in is your data for the Walsall Zero Carbon Hub scenario, because I can spot some opportunity for district heating in this. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I'm trying to, develop the concept which utilizes a lot of CO2 emissions and other things such as heat that is produced during the production process. And district heating is one of the opportunities that could be a result of this concept. And, if we get the data, that would be great. I'm currently working on a couple of companies to provide me with data so I can implement it into my graphs and my models. But I'm finding it incredibly difficult for companies to share, really. They're a bit uptight, to be honest.
No, this is that problem. So circular economy, that's absolutely, your experience is not alone. I'm happy to share what we've got. So there is a, but yeah, so I can't remember. There's a published report from phase 1, as we called it, which includes the Walsall case, but not much more than is already, I've already shared with my one slide. But behind that, there is an appendix, and I think that appendix is probably, I'll just have to check. It was Warwick Manufacturing Group did it, so I don't think there's any problem sharing it. So I'm happy to share that with you.
Brilliant.
That is an interesting. But I've just since you raised data, because for me, as I mentioned in the presentation, circular economy is a really big opportunity here, and it makes everything easier if you get it right, but it's really difficult to get it right. Data sharing between businesses is critical to getting it right, and as you say, they find it difficult. It's commercial sensitivity. Yeah. So solving that problem is one of the things which we need to attempt. There are different solutions to it. One we are beginning to play with, just to share, is the idea of actually using planning policy, and so local a kind of, or the idea of zones, so industrial zones in which you get certain benefits, TBA, but they might be business rates, or they might be guaranteed energy costs. But there's a quid pro quo, and one of the quid pro quos would be that you would have to share your data that's useful for circular economy type flows.
Well, of course, I wouldn't mind that at all. But what I'm investigating currently are in the individual stages: CO2 emissions, energy implementation, energy use, and energy loss. But it seems, if I come across data, it's old news. It's not current state of affairs, and that is what I actually need. And I mean, if you have an inroad with industry, I would be ever so happy if, you know, there was an opportunity for data sharing.
If you get in touch with me afterwards, you've got my email address there. So
yes, I have. Thank you.
We can have a conversation. Yeah, that would be great.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's a good
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. That's a good thing that Matthew is open to any collaboration, and this is the case for CCUS. We all need to help each other, and if possible, to share the data. I think the question from Youngs is same sort of questions in terms of if the data sharing would be an issue for your project.
So,
Youngs, have you received your answer, or you want to ask your question by yourself?
Hi there, so it's Charlie. I should have put my name as Charlie Youngs there, but no, Matthew, thank you very much for all this very informative, and as I said, I applaud what you're doing. I'm on the periphery of one of the other clusters and had an update from them this morning. And certainly what they're very much like you, reaching out to the bigger group of cluster sort of emitters in the area, and what they're proving a bit of challenging for them to do their modeling from a scenario analysis and potential technology application is actually companies' willingness to share data for various confidentiality or other reasons. And they're having to sort of find compromise mechanisms to limited sharing or how they use that data. Just wondering if you're experiencing similar challenges.
It's kind of yes, as I've alluded to before, and no, in the sense that we've made a lot of progress through two mechanisms. So aside from the kind of policy thing I alluded to a minute ago, one is the Black Country Economic Intelligence Unit is extremely good and has got a very good access to certainly statistical type data. So we know where energy is used. And you can very quickly, you can relate that to individual businesses. So things like energy and carbon emissions and things like that, we can get quite close to reality from data sets that are available that these kind of professional data people have at their fingertips, and they produce beautiful spatial maps and GIS type things very easily, which can be used for all sorts of things. So that kind of helps initial targeting. Then you've got local knowledge and actual relationships with the businesses. And again, I think I'm fortunate in the team in that the businesses, so we're working, so within our team, between particularly Pro-Enviro, who've been working in this area and space for nearly 40 years, the universities who also have had various programs out there, we know a lot of these businesses, not quite personally, or we can get quite close to them. And where we don't, we've actually had quite a lot of success by identifying a hotspot, if you like, using Chris and Emma at the Economic Intelligence Unit, and then basically cold calling them and saying, we're doing this project in the Black Country. You've come up on our radar. Can we come and have a conversation? So we then follow up with people. And it's a little bit what I again touched on in the presentation, which is this pragmatic bit is sending 2 or 3 people who speak engineering, manufacturing, and energy into the businesses. But first of all, targeting that using publicly available data I want to say publicly available, the public sector. So I have a lot of time in some contexts, and this is one of them, for local authorities and LEPs, if they're well organised and they've got their act together over the last 10 years, because they actually, where I have a lot of time for them is they have all this fantastic data. Where I have less time for them, and apologies if there's people on the call, is where they sit on the data and they don't realise how valuable and useful it is. So we've kind of hit a sweet spot with this project where everyone wants it to succeed. So they've been quite open with the public data. And then we're able to follow up with kind of targeted activity going actually into the businesses. And again, I think you have to sometimes, and I don't know enough about the other clusters, so again, forgive me if I misrepresent them slightly. One of our advantages is we haven't actually got as a partner, say Thomas Dudley, or a big local employer, or Jaguar Land Rover, or Ibstock, or whoever. We are entirely independent. We are a bunch of engineers and academics trying to do this, and public sector. So we're neutral. If our project was in fact being led by Tata or Liberty or someone like that, I think it might be harder to get the data. So we are kind of overtly only ever saying we're facilitating this. We are not actually doing it to ourselves, because that's not applicable, but that's not what we are.
Thank you.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I wish you the best of luck in that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you both. The next question from John. John, do you want to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Just I guess it's maybe a hostile question, but of all the things you can think of to use CCS for, what do you think would be the most valuable?
Well, so yeah, this is one of these thought-provoking questions that just exposes my assumptions, right? So I am actually, I inhabit accidentally, I've got drawn into this over time. I inhabit a world in which carbon is not desirable and is valued. So the assumption is if you manufacture carbon intense products, or you release a lot of carbon from your manufacturing processes, then you are penalized financially, and therefore your business is unsustainable. And that, when I use terms like game changer, that's what I mean. So if you can take that problem away, then you change the nature of the impending massive risk just down the line for any business in the Black Country. But it depends, doesn't it? I guess my core model, and I'm happy to be told I'm being stupid, etc., or oversimplistic. My core model is what I understand CCS is broadly used for in the coastal clusters and heavy industry is kind of smoke. You capture the carbon at the point of emission, don't you? And then you bury it under the sea. If we have the same problem, it's just smaller. I mean, so the emissions from any given site are lower. You could potentially take the problem away by switching to, so the particular problem is the processes which use gas at the moment, which if you switch them to electricity, so that they need high temperature heat, and if you switch them to electricity, they would be economically unviable because it costs 3 times as much. And so you can't take you can't capture the emissions at the point of generation. You've still got the problem at the point of use. And so it's a subset of what goes on in the Black Country, but we have more of those kind of processes than many industrial areas, I guess.
So you're saying high temperature heat is the issue.
Yeah. So it's how you capture that, or get rid of it, or substitute it with something different. And as I alluded to right at the beginning of the presentation, there may be no easy answer. You may have to go and locate where your carbon can, you may have to agglomerate, etc. I think if you start valuing carbon properly, it clearly, and it's an obvious statement to make, it clearly alters the industrial structure of the world, doesn't it? I mean, the industrial economics become completely different. And it may be things that are currently viable at small scale are no longer viable at small scale, and you have to do them at big scale because it's the only way you can do them, or maybe you have to do them somewhere else.
Well, I mean, you're presumably doing them at small scale for a reason.
Yeah, but part of that reason is economics, and proximity to the market and all those kind of things. And if you change the economics because you're being charged for every ton of carbon you emit.
Yeah, but everybody's being charged, or they've got to deal with it.
Yeah, but everyone's being charged, but some people have got economically viable solutions because they have agglomerated their manufacturing activity in such a way that they can economically capture the carbon. That's the. I'm
not sure the cost differential is as much as you think it is. I mean, it's something, but it's not infinite.
Okay.
Anyway, clearly it'll cost you more to capture at a small scale. It'll cost you more to transport it from the Black Country, but I'm not sure that if you've got a reason to be there anyway, perhaps it's still worth it.
Yeah, fine. And I think that's a good point to make. And it may expose the kind of historical, if you've got a reason to be there anyway, you which may have changed over time. We'll see.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
Great, thanks, John. The next question is from Rebecca. Rebecca, can you turn on your mic? Yeah. I know the policy and national links is one of the activities in Work Package 6 offered to Birmingham University. While answering to the question of Rebecca, perhaps Matthew, you can explain about Birmingham University's share in the activities. Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks Matthew for that talk. It's really good. I was born in Wolverhampton, so it's always nice to hear stories from the Midlands. I was just going to build firstly on the discussion you were just having with John, that if you do find that it's economical to capture carbon from any of your plants, then the infrastructure is pretty much already there for you, because you can transport it by rail, you can transport it in batches, you don't need a pipeline. So, and I'm sure you've got a good rail link to pretty much all of the clusters, so that might be worth kind of working into your thinking. And then I suppose the question I wanted to ask is just really building, you alluded to using planning policy, and I think planning is where devolved administrations such as the Scottish Government or Welsh Government or whatever have got this opportunity to go ahead of the UK government, or to tweak things to work well for their administration. I was just wondering what other things you were thinking of doing using planning policy to support decarbonisation.
So just say that last bit again, because I think I got the gist, but
I'm sorry, yeah. So just what you're thinking of doing, how you think you could use planning policy to support industrial decarbonisation.
Well, I think to encourage people to move to the right sensible sort of places, because that is quite helpful in the context of what we're trying to do. To encourage them to share data, to encourage them maybe to invest in the right kind of energy technologies. All those kind of things are doable with your planning policies. So it seems to me quite a powerful tool, really. As you said, Welsh Government, Scottish Government, devolved authorities. We're in the West Midlands Combined Authority, so we have an opportunity to do that potentially. I find it very difficult. The biggest issue I have with use of planning policy is, or the biggest challenge, is the time it takes to get the local authority planners to kind of appreciate the power that they have to really make a difference in this space, because I do think it is quite significant potentially. When you're talking about lots of small people, small manufacturing operations, and encouraging them to get together, it's one of the most powerful levers actually in local government armoury, I think.
But it definitely needs some capacity building then to be able to use it.
Thank you, Rebecca. The next question is from Harun about blue and green hydrogen and the share of hydrogen in industries, carbon capture and carbon removal. Harun, can you turn on your mic and
yeah, hi, Matthew. Thanks for your presentation, and Hamid, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Just a quick one. Green hydrogen, yes, it sounds good, but the problem is expensive to produce compared to blue hydrogen, and also there's the quantities which can be produced are no way going to be enough to make a significant impact on in the role of hydrogen as a next generation fuel. So I'm just wondering, where do you see this in the mix of when we talk about the business opportunities? Of course, blue hydrogen, you produce CO2 when you produce blue hydrogen, but then you have CCUS, so you can capture the CO2, most of it.
Yeah, I think we have some scenarios where we see this as a kind of step on a path for certain types of hub, where it might be viable. It introduces the cost of the carbon capture and getting it to the coast, doesn't it, basically, for us, which, as I think it was John was saying, maybe is not as much as I'm making out, really, or not. I'm being a bit purist, really, about being as competitive as possible, kind of relative competitive advantage, etc. I can see that potentially having a role, subject to the issue of carbon capture again, which is what we're talking about. It solves one problem and it gives you another one. Which if you aspire to be ultimately zero carbon, you've got to solve the carbon capture problem, haven't you? Then.
And I mean, I guess it depends on the scale of the cluster also. If you're talking about large industrial clusters with lots of emitters, then that's probably a different case.
I mean, the cost. So implicit in everything I'm saying is trying to do things as economically as possible, and kind of recognizing that putting things in place which are relatively expensive because of the requirement to capture carbon or whatever, makes it harder to actually put them in that place. It changes the kind of strategic options or the investment options, and therefore we're trying to come up with solutions that are, within the context of the next 20 years, permanent and will. Not as permanent as you can be in a changing world, but that make fundamental sense, that you kind of almost can't argue with, as the black country is the best place to do that. So these kind of intermediate solutions are relevant, but they're not the whole answer yet, I think. Okay,
thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Aaron. I have one final question before we wrap up the session. Matthew, what do you reckon to be the unique challenges for achieving net zero in heavy industries? For instance, in steel industry, cement or chemicals. What unique challenges we are facing in this type of industries, which is not a big problem or big case in other industries?
Well, I think it's a different kind of problem to the ones we've been facing, and I'm therefore very conscious that I know less about it. I think it's much more about there's issues about innovation and cost. I think there are also issues which there are policy and industrial strategy issues which are not always recognized in terms of how that, so you can solve that problem for heavy industry at a cost, and it's probably strategically necessary for the country, but how you actually pay for that and how that's shared across the economy and how that is supported by the rest of the country, I think are questions which do also need to be thought about sooner rather than later, rather than taken for granted. I was interested in the question that came up about Triassic salt caverns in Cannock, Worcester and Stafford, which is absolutely of interest. I will ask my colleagues, so I don't know the answer to that.
No, that's fine. I mean, we have actually seen this 10-point plan for green industrial revolution, and how that net zero is going to be achieved through that 10 points announced by government, but you don't see any direct point actually addressing heavy industries.
So no, within the concept of that document, those two documents that the government's produced in the last 6 months, I have serious concerns, and apologies if there's anyone. Well, this is a constructive comment directed in Bayes' direction. I have serious concerns that the government thinks heavy industry is the problem and the be all and end all of at times those documents drift into equating the 50 or 60 big emitters with UK industry. So the problem is solved if you sort out those 50 or 60 businesses and those 50 or 60 sites. And that is clearly not true. And not only is it not true, the problem for the other 295,000 sites around the country is a different problem. And yeah, that problem needs engaging with. So as I say, that's a constructive comment to Bayes, and it needs to be coupled with the evidence which they would quite rightly put in front of me and say, but we're funding your project in the Black Country, so we clearly recognise that there is a different problem, and we're doing our best to help you. So, which we appreciate. It's kind of the rhetoric and the reality aren't quite connected yet, but they're getting better.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. Constructive presentation and responding to the questions. Thank you to UKCCSRC for organizing this interesting webinars, and hope to see you all in future events. Over to you, Caris.
So just to echo what Hamid Reza said, thank you very much, Matthew, for joining us today. It was really interesting because we've not had the Black Country cluster join us before, so it was really interesting having you along and hearing kind of what you're bringing forwards as well in it. And we look forward to hopefully hearing from you again in the upcoming years as well.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. Next time I will bring an expert if necessary.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks
and
very
thank
much.
you for your excellent sharing today as well, Hamid Reza.
You're welcome.
And just to let everyone know, so next week we've got another cluster update. We've got the Teesside cluster next week, and Mark Lewis from Tees Valley Limited giving us an update from the Teesside cluster. So it follows on very nicely from today's session as well. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of the nice weather today, and thank you for joining us today and for an excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.